Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Apidays governance track. We've got a great number of sessions coming up, really digging into streaming APIs and event-driven architecture. So I'm excited. My name's Mark Boyd. I'm the director of Platformable, and I use the pronouns he and him. So our first speaker is Alianna, who I'll invite to the stage. Who's going to be talking about the leap from microservices to event-driven architecture, I believe.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, great. Do you want to share your slide deck so we can see?
There we go.
Excellent. Metamorphosis. Okay, we're ready to go. I'll get off the stage and leave you to it.
Thank you, Mark. So hello, everyone. My name is Alianna Inzana. My pronouns are she, her. And today I'm going to be taking you through a little bit of the event-driven evolution. So I've given this talk a couple times before, and when I have, everyone has sort of said, well, you talk in the title about evolution versus revolution, but you never really sort of discuss, well, why is that, and why should we actually want it to be that? So I wanted to actually go into that a little bit. Certainly, event-driven architectures are not new, and there's even particular protocols which predate Fielding in 2000. We know, on the other hand, that event-driven architecture has progressed quite a lot in the past 3 to 5 years. So in today's talk, I think we're going to begin sort of with a high-level survey, and we're going to look at a few of the drivers of the event-driven architecture evolution or revolution, and then sort of discuss why that might be. My premise, my thought on the matter is you can learn quite a lot from how RESTful APIs have evolved. And what was key to moving them forward, both within an individual organization, but also what was the sort of preconditions that had to be there in our industry. And we're going to use that understanding as a framework for evaluating where we are today with events and where event-driven architectures may be going. And what I always want to relate this back to, and I suspect that this is the product manager in me, is why. Why would we use EDA? And when we do use it, how do event-driven architectures provide a unique way, not only of delivering value, but also of creating value in our organizations? So I think we'll start with a couple basic sort of vocabulary words, sort of. First of all, what is an event? My favorite definition is events are the facts of a system. Each event has the potential to trigger change in state in the broader system, and the term event is used for both the type of the system and the actual event or the message payload itself. The focus of event-driven architecture is around the communication, capture, processing, and persistence of events. To contrast that to REST, in REST, you're more focused on a request that mediates a response. They've been around for a long time. Event-driven systems have been around since message-oriented middleware, but compared to REST, EDA maturity has lagged. So we know, in the mid-2000s, Martin Fowler was writing about the different architectural patterns of event-driven architecture. And we want to see how different organizations use those to derive a value from their events. There's unique protocols for the message-oriented middleware systems, and they were being used prior to them being even sort of wired up and created into distributed systems. But the environmental factors that have made EDA develop considerably in the past few years, I think there's probably any number of contributing factors, but I think the major ones with the most major impact are these three. So, first off, microservices. In SmartBear's State of API survey for at least the third year running, microservices were the technology that respondents thought would be the major growth driver for APIs and services. That was at least 61 respondents ranked that number one this year. The business value corollary to microservices is digital transformation. In other words, we modularize our business in ways that make it easier for us to interact across the many silos of a large organization. And it enables teams or divisions to act independently. So traversing those bounded contexts is not necessarily a synchronous operation. In fact, if you approached it with only synchronous operations, what you would wind up with is a distributed monolith, not discrete services that are loosely coupled at all. And I think that's important. It's also an important corollary to what's going on in sort of more broadly in engineering and development, which is agile product management, agile engineering. When we think about that, it's almost impossible to maintain the integrity of a monolith if there are separate sort of cells within the organization that are operating independently, unless you figure out a way of decoupling the synchronous nature of collaboration. And that has been sort of a big driver of the microservices explosion, I think. The next major driver, I think, is real-time applications. So I'm talking IoT devices, alerting, processing individual events and information into streams. In fact, I think digital transformation and real-time applications are often related. There is an enormous growth of data from sensors, from IoT devices, and it would be impossible to process these without the parallelization that's enabled by microservices, by event brokers. One of the most important sort of aspects of eventing is knowing whether or not the order of operations, the order of the events, is super important, and if the integrity of those events and the event stream is being maintained. In addition to ordering, there's also idempotence, which every time I hear it, I need a definition. But it's the idea that an event is delivered exactly once. Certainly, we wouldn't mind if a transaction that was delivering our paycheck to our bank account happened twice. However, it would be sort of disappointing when eventually one of those transactions was revoked. So on the back end, microservices and tech need to push the event revolution. But on the front end, the real-time apps, I think that's going to be the focal point of innovation in the next few years. And finally, I truly believe this. Without a common vocabulary to describe events and event infrastructure, it is very challenging to share the value you've created. And as you'll see, as I sort of tackle the API and event maturity curve, sharing the value that you've created is a big driver from tactical use of event-driven architecture and even RESTful architecture to a more strategic approach to APIs and services. The cloud element spec, the initial sort of spec around asynchronous services, was really focused on the event and the message payload, which is important. But you can't read a letter if the post office doesn't know where to deliver it. Or I guess to be a little bit more analogous to the actual experience, if you don't know where to go to pick up your mail from a post office box. So specifications are a means to create programmatic interaction with event-driven services. But instead of hand coding each of these interactions, whether they're a test or an integration, we can hook into the structure that a spec provides and reduce the need for bespoke code or refactoring. And I think, again, we're seeing a very similar trajectory when we look at how the journey that RESTful APIs have taken, and now we're seeing the same types of things that are appearing in event-driven architecture on the back of the async API specification. So as an industry and within our individual organizations, there are going to be a few recognizable phases, I guess, to maturing our practices and our approach to APIs and services. Obviously, as with anything, at each level, there are both intrinsic and extrinsic factors that either hold us back or push us forward. And while certain elements of any maturity model are unique, the underlying principles that drove API maturity will also drive service maturity. It's not all that different. But where an individual organization lies on the maturity continuum for REST versus for REST versus event-driven services often is different. So I do want to say, as a footnote, I am indebted to David Mutter, senior analyst at Forrester, for his work on the event-driven architecture maturity path. It actually was kind of funny. We presented together last April. He was going to be tackling EDA and architectural patterns for EDA, while I was talking about the ramifications for testing. And what I was particularly impressed by, I guess, was, I had long had sort of a maturity curve that I used when I was talking about API maturity, and David's boxes for event-driven maturity actually very closely correlated with the things that we had seen for APIs. And so, with his permission, I'm using his maturity model and kind of compiling it together with the API maturity model. So thanks again to David. So one thing that David has noted in his interactions with many organizations is that right now, in general, larger organizations, the type of organizations that reach out to Forrester for help in their architectural decisions, they are really at this tactical phase. And the most advanced organizations are really only in this second tactical consolidated box. Whereas what I would say from a API perspective, from a REST perspective, we're really seeing people at this third level of maturity. We have definitely moved into a more strategic approach to RESTful architecture, and that is, I think, being seen uniformly across the board. So let's begin at the beginning and talk about the first steps into adoption of APIs and services. So when you begin, in the beginning, I guess you could say there was abstraction, right? Your first API was likely to be an abstraction over a database. And in many cases, that abstraction was not terribly abstract either. In event-driven architectures, the first service you create is typically a point-to-point connection. So the events were being used out of necessity to call a function, or because polling was inefficient. It's not an architectural pattern, it's a coding pattern here. In practice, this coding pattern is often facilitated via a simple message queue. Maybe it's a handshake to validate the message, like in validate message delivery, rather, like in RabbitMQ or WebSphere. Excuse me. The shared characteristics with REST include lack of complexity, and the value that you're creating isn't shared value. In other words, Bob is creating his first API as an abstraction over a database. The first event stream was created as a coding pattern. And in EDA, the approach, the general approach, as well as the approach when you're designing your first REST service, is really characterized by decentralization. In other words, you're doing your own thing, even if you're operating in a larger organization. In event-driven architecture, this decentralization manifests in how broker tech is chosen. Basically, they use whatever is around and also whatever is free. Because events are a coding pattern, they aren't an architectural decision. It's low stakes, but low stakes is often how we begin. And APIs or services are entirely independent from each other, but also from the broader ecosystem. Now, the interesting thing about creating value in a manner that is inherently consumable is that other people are going to want to use it. When others in our organization find uses for an API, initially, knowledge of how to use that API passes via word of mouth. But the first thing that really pushes us to the next level of maturity, the driver really is consumption. Simply put, asking Bob how his API works at a certain point is no longer a scalable solution. And so Bob perhaps annotates his code to generate a spec. He does this as an aid to discoverability. He does this to help out the QA team. In the big picture, this code-first approach is the origin story for some major specification formats, like OAS, the spec formerly known as Swagger. So collaboration and test automation are easier if everyone uses a common language to describe APIs, both how they're structured and where they're deployed. Now, I don't want to downplay the role of tools contributing to or holding back maturity, particularly when it comes to events. In 2020, Akamai's platforms processed more than 300 trillion API requests. That was a 53% year-over-year increase. APIs demonstrate that growth without overhead of maintaining long-lived connections or having a potentially millions of concurrent consumers. Events within the confines of our own organizational silos can be easier to access, to manipulate, to secure, but to transmit events outside of our technological perimeter, we often run up against barriers that require event-focused tooling and platforms to overcome. What I've personally seen is quite a lot of orgs use events internally. They use tech like Kafka clusters, but they treat their data like a negative pressure room in Contagion. With a certain amount of documentation and information sharing, this might work behind the scenes, but to pull the data forward to make it customer-facing, organizations run up against a few problems. Number one, data egress is super expensive. Number two, security is tricky. And number three, long-lived connections streaming a lot of data can be horribly non-performant. So in short, the reason many organizations stall out in the collaboration automation phase of event-driven maturity is directly correlated to their appetite for managing this crazy level of complexity at organizational scale, right? The ability to embrace the uncertainty of opening your services to the outside world is both less architecturally complex in REST, but it also benefits from many years of learnings from implementation and tooling. For event-driven architecture, narrowing the broker selection allows teams to reuse or repurpose their integrations. And this is similar for APIs. Basically, everybody doesn't have to reinvent the wheel every time someone wants to use Elasticsearch or connect to Stripe for payment processing. So I don't want to downplay the role of tools. What begins as improvements to awareness becomes the foundation for true intentionality. Tools play a role. They can assist with testing, automation, prototyping, and validation for design first in APIs, and at least for greenfield and use of event-driven architectural patterns. For example, the REST-like event-carried state transfer might involve a more complex web of interactions. Excuse me, like event sourcing with CQRS, command query responsibility segregation. The central nervous system of these interactions becomes events. Both APIs and event-driven architecture experience a consolidation of tools and tech. Frameworks and spec-based tooling make automation easier. Broker technology becomes standardized throughout the organization. It allows for more fluid collaboration and cross-pollination between individuals and teams. The patterns and tech of the collaboration automation phase are most easily mediated at the level of an individual team or small business unit. Like you're sharing, but you're sharing amongst your closest friends. In the organizational phase, this is the first sort of real strategic phase of event-driven management, also REST management, APIs and services shift from being used idiosyncratically and they become governed. Governance is such an important concept at this phrase that Forrester calls the whole phase governed. This shift is underpinned by the use of tools and frameworks to level set expectations around performance, reliability, discoverability, and straight up governance. I would go as far as to say that if this phrase had a catchphrase, it might be the evolution of reasonable expectations. Strategic management at organizational scale is not only about specs or code or even people. It must be the proverbial three-legged stool. People who agree to a process, which is guided but also enforced by tools. Whereas the proto-service back, 4 slides ago, was perhaps building an abstraction over a database, we are now actually building abstractions over those abstractions. And despite the bounded context of domains, business units that help us de-silo and enrich data in the enterprise, data becomes a consumer market. That's a power shift that's fully realized in the final phase, the transformative phase or developer experience. As we've progressed through the stages of API and service maturity, we focus on singular types. API monoculture, everything is REST, everything is Kafka. But when we reach organizational scale, there's a shift away from that myopic focus on a single API style. Because you're not just talking about the warehouse team that's working on the inventory API. Instead, you're actually embracing a broader definition of done, and that is going to encompass layers of pooled data from many different sources. In most organizations, they will be employing multiple API protocols to achieve this depth of insight. And then developer or event portals are going to be key to centralizing the value that's created and make that content accessible throughout the org. And unsurprisingly, this is one of the areas where event-driven services lag considerably. Few vendors are tackling the challenge of event portals, and even fewer are trying to aggregate multiple styles and multiple protocols within a single developer portal. So the final push to the next level of maturity comes when an organization's APIs and services not only deliver business value, but the entire organization acknowledges it. The first 2 phases, the tactical phases, they're focused on an API or event provider. The strategic phases, they really represent the rise of the API or event consumer. In the sort of topmost phase, events and APIs are not a means to an end, nor are they viewed as solely a technical how, but they're also the what. They create and deliver on the business strategy. This is where we're thinking about events and APIs as products, and this is why I think of this final phase as developer experience. Usability is actually accorded the same level of focus and investment as a customer-facing product would be. And theoretically, this is a good thing, right? But even as specs are embedded within developer or event portals, and they're invoked for security or development metadata, we can see where if we didn't have specifications to describe and tooling to support our APIs and events, this evolutionary process would stall out. So I absolutely love this quote. John Houston Finley describes maturity as the capacity to endure uncertainty. If the events of the past year have shown us nothing else, they've proven that organizational resilience is tested more by an uncertain future than by failed products, missed markets, even scandals. The breadth and depth of data available could paralyze a less mature organization. Through APIs and events, there are ways to learn and analyze the systems without real-world impact, concepts such as the digital twin.
This is really fascinating, Alianna. We are about to hit our time. How can people get in touch with you? I mean, the digital twins, for example, is really ramping up at the moment. So I'm sure there'll be questions about this. The discussion of the event maturity model is fantastic.
Yeah, I think it's an area where we as an industry, we really do need to focus on the past, on how we've matured REST, because the event-driven future is going to stall out without some of the tooling, without some of the underpinnings that we've already given to REST. And I do think it's an evolutionary change, not a revolution. A revolution, you don't recognize the, how it started when you're in the how's it going picture. And honestly, what I think is so special about event-driven architecture is it is often, especially in a microservices architecture, it's often happening with RESTful services that have been around for a really long time. And so it may take time in aggregate to achieve, but specific items actually can happen very quickly. And that's the same as with evolution in, unicellular organisms even.
Exactly. Yeah. Now look, so it's fascinating conversation. Do you have your final slide with the email? Oh, there we go, with your contact details. So
everyone, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or on Twitter. And also I will be launching my website, aliannainzana.com. And that you'll have a few different ways of reaching out to me there, and also be able to see the slides from this presentation. And I think probably a few articles eventually from this presentation, because I think this is something we all need to sort of have a think on.
Fantastic. Thanks for kicking off our next session of talks with such an inspiring start. Okay, I'll invite you now to leave this.